Let me ask you something and be honest with yourself. Have you ever judged someone just by looking at them? Maybe it was a guy on the street corner with torn-up clothes, holding a cardboard sign. Maybe you locked your doors. Maybe you turned your head. Or maybe you said something cruel. Something you didn't mean. Something you regret. What if I told you that the person you judged had a story you couldn't imagine? What if I told you that behind that ragged coat and unwashed face was a human being just like you? Someone who once had dreams, family, a normal life, until everything changed. In the next few minutes, you're going to see what really happened the day a man yelled at a homeless guy on the street. And what he found out just seconds later will stop you in your tracks. This story, it's raw, it's real, and it's going to make you think twice the next time you pass someone sitting on the sidewalk. Trust me, this is not just another feel-good story or one of those scripted viral clips. This is different. This is what happens when judgment meets truth. And when truth hurts so much, it cracks your soul wide open. Now I know what you're thinking. You clicked on this video because you wanted to know what could possibly make someone who's yelling, angry, and dismissive completely break down and see the world in a different way. And I promise you before this video ends, you will get your answer. You'll get all of it. But more importantly, you're going to feel it. Because this story isn't just about what happened to one man on one street. It's about all of us. Our assumptions, our mistakes, and our moments of clarity. I want you to stay with me through this journey. Not because I want views, not because of some algorithm, but because this is the kind of story that changes how we look at each other. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. You're going to walk away different. That's a promise. Now let's rewind just a little bit. It was a regular Wednesday afternoon in downtown Los Angeles. Sunlight bouncing off the glass of high-rise buildings, the usual rush of cars honking, engines revving, and the subtle hum of a city that never really stops. People were out, some heading to work, some taking late lunch breaks, and some just trying to survive. On the corner of 7th and Main, right next to an old deli, sat a man. His hair was wild, his clothes mismatched and grimy, and his face. You could see he'd lived through things most of us only see in movies. He wasn't bothering anyone. Just sitting there, holding a small wrinkled sign that read, "Please, anything helps. God bless." And that was it. He didn't beg, didn't shout, didn't even make eye contact with the people walking by. He was just present, invisible in plain sight. And then came Eric. Now Eric, he's not a bad guy. At least not intentionally. Mid-30s, works in tech, just got out of a rough divorce, drives a Tesla, wears sneakers that cost more than some people's rent. He had just left a stressful meeting and was pacing down the street, earbuds in, completely absorbed in a call. That's when he saw the homeless man. And that's when something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe it was the years of bottled-up frustration. Maybe it was ego. But he stopped, looked at the man, and said words that would later haunt him. Words that weren't just rude, they were cruel. He shouted, right there in front of everyone, "Why don't you get a job like the rest of us? You people are ruining this city." The man didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just looked up at Eric, and what happened next changed everything. But I'm going to pause here because this is where the real story begins. I want you to really think about this moment. Not just watch it. Think about what it means. Because this isn't just about one man yelling at another. This is about what we carry inside. How quickly we let our assumptions guide our behavior. This is about us. Every single one of us who's ever judged too fast, spoken too soon, or failed to see the full picture. And that's why I need you to watch this video till the end. Not because I'm telling you some fairy tale with a perfect ending, but because the story that unfolds next, what Eric learns about this homeless man, what he discovers about himself, and what you are about to feel, is something truly unforgettable. And once the truth is revealed, it might just hit you where it hurts, or where it heals. So let me introduce you to James. James didn't always live on the streets. In fact, just a few years ago he had a career, a family, and a mortgage. He used to wear suits, not hoodies. Used to have business lunches, not wait in line at shelters. But one wrong turn, one devastating loss, and a system that failed him, turned his life upside down. I'm not going to give it all away just yet, but I'll tell you this. What Eric finds out about James will flip everything he thought he knew. It'll make him question his own privilege, his pain, and his purpose. Now, I know most videos give away too much too early. They hit you with a climax and hope you stick around. But we're doing it differently. 'Cause real storytelling takes time. And trust. And I'm trusting you to give me that time. I'm trusting that you'll stay with me. Not just for the drama, but for the heart of this story. For the message behind it. And because maybe, just maybe, there's a piece of James in all of us. Or a bit of Eric we haven't owned up to yet. As we dive deeper into this moment, you're going to hear something that will make your heart ache. And your eyes sting a little. You're going to hear the words James says back to Eric after being yelled at. Words that aren't angry. Words that aren't defensive. Just real, honest, human. And those words are the ones that stop Eric cold. The ones that make him drop his phone, forget his meeting, and sit down beside the man he just insulted. But here's the thing. What James tells Eric. It isn't just a story. It's a confession. And that's where it all changes. So don't go anywhere. Because the next part. It's the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. Mark stood there frozen. His coffee slowly leaking through the seams of the paper cup, dripping down onto his shoes, forgotten in his hand. Everything around him. The distant wail of a siren, the beep of crosswalks, the hum of morning traffic. All of it faded into static as he stared into the man's eyes. And those eyes. They weren't just tired or worn from the sun. They were familiar. Not in a generic sense, not a maybe we've met before kind of way. No, Mark knew them. He couldn't explain how or why just yet, but a strange knot began to form in his stomach, one that tightened with every passing second. David said nothing else, just held Mark's gaze like someone who'd already lived through 1,000 unspoken conversations. There was pain there, but also something that resembled recognition, and that made it worse. Because now Mark was doubting himself, questioning what he thought he knew. And that's where the unraveling begins. Over the past few months, Mark had been pushing harder than ever, expanding his company, buying into new real estate deals, trying to cement his place as one of the most self-made success stories in the state. He'd become obsessed with metrics, constantly checking views on his latest motivational reels, reposting clips about financial freedom, about not making excuses, about waking up at 5 a.m. and grinding. To the world, Mark was thriving. He looked like the American dream wrapped in a power suit. But behind that was a storm he
wasn't ready to admit to anyone, not even himself. His marriage had been strained for years, his teenage son barely spoke to him anymore, and his father's recent death had stirred up emotions he thought he'd buried decades ago. In private, Mark was unraveling. He hadn't slept through the night in weeks. Every deal felt like another brick on his chest. And lately, no matter how many wins he collected, none of it felt like enough. Still, he kept pushing. Because slowing down meant having to deal with everything he'd buried. And Mark? He wasn't the type to look back. The weird thing was, Mark had walked past that cafe almost every day. He'd seen the man with the cardboard sign a few times before, but had never paid much attention. Just another figure on the sidewalk, one of the hundreds blending into the noise of the city. But now, something about him felt like a thread connected to something deeper, something Mark couldn't quite name. That morning hadn't started like anything out of the ordinary. He was supposed to be meeting an investor, someone big in tech, who was looking to offload some commercial properties in Venice Beach. Mark had been chasing the deal for weeks. He woke up late, spilled coffee on his dress shirt, argued with his assistant over Zoom, and nearly got into a fender bender on the way downtown. His nerves were already frayed. So when he saw David, when he saw that sign, it all snapped. But what he couldn't explain was why this particular man, this moment, shook him so deeply. As he stood there, trying to collect himself, bits and pieces of memory started surfacing, flashes of a face, maybe younger, maybe smiling, maybe in a completely different context. Mark felt his throat tighten. He crouched down slowly, hesitantly, like someone reaching for a grenade they're not sure is still alive. Do I know you from somewhere?" he asked again, quieter this time, the anger from earlier draining out of him like a deflated balloon. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down, his fingers nervously smoothing out the creases in the cardboard. "You used to," he said softly, barely above a whisper. And just like that, the seed of doubt in Mark's mind exploded into full-blown panic. He scanned the man's face again, but the dirt, the facial hair, the layers of grime, it all blurred the details. What was David not saying? Why wouldn't he just tell him? Here's where things start getting even more complicated. Because the truth is, David's fall from grace wasn't sudden. It didn't happen in a single night. And it wasn't even really about money at first. No, it started years ago, quietly, like a crack in the foundation. He had been a software engineer, freelancing for various startups, some of which eventually became massive names in the tech industry. David had once lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Silver Lake, with a girlfriend who loved him and a side hustle restoring old guitars. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. Until one day, something changed. A project went south. Payments got delayed. A lawsuit was filed against the startup he had partial equity in. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, grinding collapse of everything he'd built. And then came the accident. But here's where we twist the story a little. Because if you're expecting the usual, he lost his job, got addicted, ended up on the streets plot, you're going to be surprised. It wasn't addiction. It wasn't laziness. And it wasn't failure. In fact, there's a part of David's story that still doesn't quite add up. The people who knew him said he just disappeared one day. His landlord mentioned he moved out without a word. His social accounts went dark. He stopped replying to emails, even job offers. Some of his friends thought he'd moved out of state. Others wondered if he'd gotten caught up in something darker. But none of them knew the truth. Not even Mark. And as Mark tried to search the man's face for answers, it became clear that David wasn't just some stranger who had fallen on hard times. He was hiding something. Mark's mind started racing. Was this someone from his past? A client he'd screwed over? An old classmate he'd bullied? He couldn't be sure, and David wasn't helping. Every vague answer felt like a trap. And yet, there was something undeniably familiar about the way David spoke, calm, measured, like someone who had learned to live with pain in complete silence. And here's where I want you, the viewer, to really tune in. Because this is where stories like these get complicated. You want answers. You want to know the twist. But life doesn't give them to us neatly. Sometimes people vanish for reasons they can't explain. Sometimes the truth is buried under years of shame, loss, and survival. And sometimes the person we least expect to be connected to our past is the one who knows the most about who we really are. The real kicker? David had something with him that morning. Something strange. Tucked inside the torn backpack at his side was a photograph, worn, water-damaged, the edges curled. And in that photo was a teenage Mark, smiling, arm around someone just out of frame. Mark hadn't seen that photo in over 2 decades. He didn't even know it still existed. But David had it. Which means David knew something Mark had forgotten. Or tried to forget. And just as Mark was about to ask how he got it, David zipped the backpack closed again. "Not yet," he said, voice barely audible. "You're not ready to remember." Now the story's got layers. Mark isn't just dealing with guilt anymore. He's dealing with fear. Fear that his past is catching up to him. Fear that someone out here knows his secrets. And fear that the version of himself he's tried so hard to curate, the success, the hustle, the ambition, might all be built on a lie. But what kind of lie? And why would David, a man living on the streets, be the one holding the key? This is where we stop. For now. Because what happens next will force Mark to choose between protecting his carefully built image and uncovering the painful truth of who David really is, and how their lives are more entangled than he ever imagined. Let me know if you want me to continue the next chapter, because this story, it's just getting started. The photo haunted Mark long after he left the sidewalk. He didn't even remember walking back to his car, only that his hands were trembling as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath uneven like he'd just run a mile uphill. The way David had looked at him, like he was holding something vital over his head, made Mark feel exposed in a way he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. That photograph had unlocked something, an old door in his memory he thought he'd sealed shut long ago. But now that door was open, and behind it was a part of himself he didn't want to revisit. Still, there was something else now. Something darker. Because what disturbed him more than anything wasn't that David knew him. It was the quiet certainty in his voice when he said, "You're not ready to remember." That wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And it echoed in Mark's mind like a bell tolling in the distance, signaling something awful on the horizon. That night, Mark didn't go home. He drove aimlessly through the city, pulling over once in an abandoned parking lot, then again under a freeway overpass. He kept trying to shake the feeling, but it lingered, an invisible weight pressing against his chest. At some point, maybe around midnight, he found himself parked outside an old diner in Glendale. It wasn't intentional, just muscle memory. He used to come here late at night with his brother when they were kids, back when they'd sneak out of the house and waste coins on jukebox songs and greasy cheeseburgers. His brother, Ben, had always been the wild one, the rebel. The one who broke curfews and pushed buttons. Mark, by contrast, had been the rule follower, the planner. But that was a long time ago. They hadn't spoken in over 3 years. Not since the inheritance dispute after their father died. Mark hadn't forgiven Ben for contesting the will, and Ben hadn't forgiven Mark for following their father's wishes to the letter. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the unresolved pain they'd both carried since childhood, pain that had never been named or healed, just buried. But when Mark checked his phone, he noticed something that made his heart stop. A text message from Ben, sent just 5 minutes ago. "You ever seen this before?" It was a photo. Blurry. Poor lighting. But unmistakably the same picture David had shown Mark that morning. The same old photo from decades ago. The one with Mark as a teenager, grinning, arm around someone who was just out of frame. Only this time, the frame wasn't cut off. This time, the full picture was visible. Mark stared at it in disbelief. Because the person next to him in the photo, the one who had been cropped out in David's version, wasn't David. It was someone else entirely. A third person neither of them had spoken about in years. A kid named Jesse. And here's where things start to fracture. Jesse had been Mark and Ben's best friend back in high school. The kind of friend who practically lived at your house, who knew your secrets, your crushes, your fights with your parents. He was funny, brilliant, and fearless. But he'd also vanished one summer. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. The story around town was that Jesse's family moved out of state after some trouble at home. But the truth? The real truth? Mark had buried that along with every other part of that year. Because Jesse's disappearance wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. And now that photo, resurfacing out of nowhere after all these years, suggested someone wanted Mark and Ben to remember what happened. The real question was, why now? Mark immediately called Ben, but it went to voicemail. So he sent a follow-up text. "Where did you get that?" No reply. Another message followed. "Do you remember that night?" Still no reply. Mark's mind spiraled. What if David wasn't who he thought he was? What if the photo was planted? Or worse, what if David was connected to Jesse, not as a friend, but as someone else entirely? The fact that he had a cropped version of the same image Ben just received in full was too coincidental. And now that Mark thought about it, the way David spoke, the way he seemed to withhold pieces of the story, it felt orchestrated. Like a slow reveal of guilt designed to reel Mark into something larger. Something buried. Something dangerous. But what Mark didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Ben had also gotten a second message that night. From an unknown number. No words. Just a screenshot of a police report. Dated 23 years ago. A missing persons file. Jesse's. The name had been redacted, but the birth date, photo, and timestamp were unmistakable. And at the bottom, a note. Not everything you remember is true. That message was not sent to Mark. Not yet. Only to Ben. And that alone was enough to rattle even someone as hard-headed as him. Because Ben did remember that summer. The fights. The lie they all agreed to. And most of all, the night Jesse disappeared. But Ben had always assumed Jesse stayed gone because that's what Jesse wanted. Now, the evidence suggested someone had been keeping tabs. Watching. Waiting. Which meant someone was ready to uncover the truth. Back in his car, Mark stared at the photo on his phone, eyes tracing every pixel, hoping to find some detail he'd missed. But it was the same. That dumb teenage grin. That jacket he used to wear all the time. And Jesse, laughing beside him, like they hadn't a care in the world. But why would David have a version that cut Jesse out? Was it on purpose? A message? Or was David not the one pulling the strings after all? Maybe he was just the first domino. Maybe there were more people involved. People from their past, people who knew what really happened. Mark's head pounded. He had spent so long distancing himself from the past, from his family, from the pain of his childhood, and now it was clawing its way back with surgical precision. Then his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Just one line this time. "You're next." Everything in Mark's body went cold. He didn't know what it meant exactly, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening wasn't random. Someone was peeling back the layers on purpose. And if Mark didn't figure out who and why, they might all be forced to face a truth none of them were prepared to handle. Let me know when you're ready for the next chapter, because the trail of this story only gets darker from here. The next morning broke through with that pale, washed-out light that Los Angeles sometimes gets after a long night of dry winds and sleepless thoughts. Mark sat in his kitchen, the only sound being the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional clink of his spoon in the untouched bowl of cereal in front of him. He hadn't slept. Not even for a minute. His phone lay on the table, screen still glowing from a message he couldn't stop reading. "You're next." The words had burrowed into his thoughts, repeating like a song you can't shake. The photo, the text from Ben, the sudden reappearance of David, all of it was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like the opening moves in a very deliberate game. A game Mark didn't realize he was already playing. But what he didn't expect was how fast the next piece would fall into place, and how completely it would destroy the narrative he thought he understood. Around 9 a.m., just as he was debating whether to call Ben again or show up at his place unannounced, his doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. No deliveries. No scheduled meetings. And the moment he checked the security feed from his phone, his heart nearly stopped. It was David, standing right there, looking completely different. The scruffy beard was trimmed. His clothes, while still worn, were clean. His eyes were sharp, alert, not the vacant stare Mark had seen just a day ago. It was like he had stepped into a new version of himself overnight. Mark didn't even have time to think. He opened the door slowly, cautiously, unsure of what kind of conversation he was about to step into. But David wasn't here to ask for anything. He was here to talk. And what he said next shattered everything. "I lied," he began, stepping into the house like he'd been there before. "Not about knowing you. About who I am. I'm not who you think I am, and I never was." Mark stood frozen, every hair on his body raised. David walked past him and sat at the kitchen table, looking eerily comfortable. "You remember Jesse," he continued. "Of course you do. But you don't remember the truth. Because the version of that story, the one you've been telling yourself for over 20 years, it's wrong. Deliberately wrong. You didn't forget. You were made to forget." That's when Mark noticed something else. David had brought a folder. Old papers. Clippings. A USB drive. Photos. "I wasn't the homeless guy with a sad story," David said. "I was the observer. I was the reminder. And now, I'm the one who's going to show you what you erased." Mark could barely process the words. He sat down slowly, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "Jesse disappeared. That was it." David shook his head slowly, almost like he pitied him. "No. Jesse didn't just disappear. He was disappeared. There's a difference. And you were part of it. So was Ben. You just don't know it yet." That single sentence hit Mark like a brick wall. Because now everything was beginning to reframe. The strange photo. The text messages. The way David always seemed one step ahead. He wasn't just someone from the past. He was someone who had been watching it all from the outside. And then came the reveal that truly flipped the entire story on its head. David opened the folder and slid a document across the table. Mark's eyes locked onto the page. It was a medical report. Old, yellowed, with Jesse's name at the top. But it wasn't a death certificate. It wasn't a missing person form. It was a psychological evaluation from a state facility, dated 2 years after Jesse was supposedly gone. It listed signs of trauma, memory manipulation, severe dissociative episodes, and a peculiar note scrawled in pen at the bottom. Patient insists 2 close friends are lying about an incident that occurred at a cabin in Big Bear. Requests legal intervention. Denied. Mark's jaw dropped. He remembered Big Bear. One summer trip. Just the 3 of them. But nothing had happened there. At least, not that he could remember. That cabin, David said quietly, was the beginning of the cover-up. And what you experienced there wasn't real. It was constructed. Implanted. The room went silent. Mark's entire worldview began to collapse in real time. Because now the question wasn't just what happened to Jesse, it was what was done to all of them. Who had the power to manipulate their memories? Why would anyone go to those lengths? And why was it resurfacing now? David finally leaned forward. You need to talk to your mother, he said. She's the only one who was there when you came back from that trip. And she's the only one who signed off on the therapy sessions afterward. Sessions you don't remember, because you were sedated. And just like that, the story cracked open into something deeper, darker, and far more controlled than Mark had imagined. His own mother. The woman who raised him, who always deflected when he brought up the past. She wasn't just a bystander. She was part of it. Mark's hands were shaking. All his life, he thought his childhood trauma was just a collection of repressed grief and broken relationships. But now it looked like someone had carefully edited his memories, deleted scenes, manipulated frames, rewritten dialogue, and the life he had built was based on a version of reality that might not even be his own. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. And then David said something that turned the knife just a bit more. This isn't just about Jesse, he said. There were others. And they're starting to remember too. You weren't the only one altered. But you were the first. Which makes you the most dangerous. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. The man in front of him wasn't just a drifter with a tragic backstory. He was a catalyst. And now Mark had to decide whether to confront the people who raised him or continue living in the fragile illusion he had fought so hard to maintain. But before Mark could ask another question, David stood up, picked up the folder, and walked to the door. You'll find the rest when you're ready, he said, nodding toward the USB drive left on the table. But don't wait too long. Others are watching now. And if you don't uncover the truth, someone else will uncover it for you. As the door clicked shut behind him, Mark sat in stunned silence, staring at the drive like it was a live wire. He didn't know what was on it. He didn't know who else was involved. But one thing was crystal clear now. This wasn't about a man yelling at a homeless guy. This was about unraveling an entire false history. And the real story, whatever it was going to cost more than just his peace of mind. It might cost him everything. Let me know when you're ready for the next turn, because the real puppeteer behind all this? They haven't even stepped into the light yet. Mark sat in silence, the USB drive untouched on the table like a loaded weapon. The early morning had now bled into late afternoon, but time had no meaning anymore. His mind was crowded with fragments, memories that didn't match, people he trusted suddenly wearing masks, and that one constant thread pulling tighter around his chest. The truth was no longer buried. It was bleeding through the cracks. He hadn't touched his phone since David left, afraid that one more message might finally unravel him completely. But deep down, he knew what had to be done. He had to confront his mother. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Today. Because if what David said was even halfway true, then the woman who raised him, the one person he always thought stood on the side of love and protection, had been part of a secret that changed the trajectory of his entire life. Driving to her house felt like walking into a courtroom without knowing the charges. The air felt heavier the closer he got to the neighborhood he grew up in. The trees hadn't changed. The streets still curved in the familiar way he remembered from bike rides and late-night sneaking out. But the house looked different now. It had the same bricks, the same pale blue shutters, but it no longer looked like home. It looked like the place where something was taken from him. He sat in the car outside her driveway for nearly 10 minutes before finally stepping out. His legs felt weak. His stomach churned. But something stronger than fear pushed him forward. It was a need to know, not just for himself, but for Jesse, for Ben, and for the others David had hinted at. If their lives had been altered without consent, without memory, then every second spent in the dark was 1 second too long. She answered the door quickly, surprised but warm, like any mother would be. "Mark, baby, what a surprise," she said, reaching for a hug. But he didn't return it. She noticed. Her eyes studied his face, her smile fading. "What's wrong?" she asked. Mark took a breath, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't want comfort. "We need to talk," he said, voice barely holding together. "About Jesse. About what happened after Big Bear." The color drained from her face. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A crack in the porcelain. "Why are you bringing that up now?" she said, trying to sound casual. But her eyes were already scanning him, calculating. Mark walked to the living room, glanced at the family photos on the shelf, moments frozen in time, but now questionable. "Because someone finally showed me what I forgot. Or what I was made to forget." His mother's shoulders stiffened. She didn't deny it. That alone nearly broke him. "There were reasons, Mark," she said softly. "You don't understand what you were like when you came home. You were shattered. All three of you were. You were having episodes, screaming in your sleep, claiming things that couldn't be real. Jesse was in worse shape than anyone." Mark turned to face her. "So you signed papers? You sent us to someone who what? Erased our memories? Who gave us new ones?" She didn't respond, but her silence was louder than words. "You said I was just dealing with stress. That I made it all worse by clinging to things. You told me Jesse moved away, and I believed you." Her eyes welled up with tears. "You were too young to carry the weight of what happened. I did what I thought was best." But that excuse sounded hollow now. It wasn't about protecting him. It was about control. About preserving a version of events that suited someone else's agenda. "Do you even remember what happened?" he asked. Her answer shook him to the core.
"Not all of it," she said.
"Some of it I chose to forget too. They offered that option for family members. I didn't want to live with the nightmares." That's when the twist hit him hardest. His mother wasn't just a passive participant. She had been offered the same treatment. And she accepted. She willingly wiped part of her own memory to escape a truth too dark to face. "Who offered it to you?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. She hesitated. "There was a program. A government-funded mental health initiative. It was supposed to help trauma victims. But it was experimental, and I think Jesse was the test subject." Everything tilted. The foundation of the story shifted beneath Mark's feet. It wasn't just childhood trauma. It wasn't just bad therapy. It was systemic. Structured. Someone had used Jesse, as part of something bigger. "Why didn't you stop it?" he demanded. "Why didn't you pull us out?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because we were threatened. I didn't know who they were, but they said if we didn't cooperate, they'd take you away. You were already so fragile. I couldn't lose you too." And now Mark was faced with an impossible choice. If he pursued the truth, if he dug deeper into this program and tried to expose the people behind it, he could very well put himself and everyone connected to it in danger. But if he walked away now, if he let the memories remain fractured and unfinished, he'd never be whole again, and neither would Jesse, if he was even still alive. Before he could decide, his phone vibrated again. Another message. This one from an anonymous number, but clearly meant for him. A simple image. Surveillance footage. From the parking lot of the diner he visited the night before. The timestamp was just minutes after he left. The figure in the photo was unmistakable, Ben. And next to him, someone Mark hadn't seen in over 2 decades. It wasn't David. It was Jesse. Alive. Looking right into the camera. Let me know when you're ready to dive into what happens next, because nothing about this story is what it seems anymore, and the next choice Mark makes could destroy everything he thought he was protecting. Mark's heart pounded as he stared at the photo on his phone. The grainy diner parking lot security feed might have been captured on a low-end camera, but there was no mistaking the face. Jesse, alive, standing side by side with Ben, both of them looking directly at the lens, like they knew the shot was being taken, like they wanted him to see it. Mark's fingers trembled as he enlarged the image. His childhood best friend, the boy whose disappearance had shattered him, whose memory had been twisted and buried under years of manipulated recollection, was not only alive, he was apparently working with the very person Mark had begun to fear was keeping secrets. The one person he had leaned on through every phase of this unraveling. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't even register right away. It just sinks slowly, like poison, paralyzing from the inside out. Panic set in. Questions started crashing against each other. Had Ben known the truth this whole time? Was he part of the program? Was he just another puppet like David? Or worse, one of the puppeteers? Mark's first instinct was to run, to get out of the house, the neighborhood, maybe even the city.
But he knew that would be pointless now.
They were watching him. The photo proved it. They weren't just letting him follow the breadcrumbs, they were leaving them for him. That meant they were trying to lead him somewhere. But why now? Why Jesse? And why show their hand after all this time? The USB drive David had left on the table still hadn't been touched. Something about it felt radioactive, like whatever it contained could detonate everything. But the betrayal he felt staring at Jesse's face gave him no more room for hesitation. He grabbed his laptop, slid in the drive, and waited. What loaded up wasn't a file. It was a full interface, a custom-designed program masked as a simple folder. No labels, just an input field asking for a passcode. His mind scrambled, trying to think of what it could be. He typed Big Bear. Rejected. He tried Jesse. Nothing. Then he remembered what David said. You were the first. He typed subject 001. The screen blinked, then opened. The files that appeared weren't just documents. They were dossiers. Names. Photos. Audio logs. Psychological evaluations. And there, in the center of the chaos, was his. A full profile. Mark Reeves, initial subject. Filed under Operation Mirror Lake. The name meant nothing to him, but the contents of the file were impossible to dismiss. Scans of his brain. Video of therapy sessions he had no memory of. Transcripts of conversations he never recalled having. All conducted under the guise of mental health rehabilitation. It wasn't just him, Jesse, and Ben. There were others. Dozens. Some of them he recognized from high school. Others were strangers. But they all had one thing in common. They had all participated in the same summer program their senior year. The program was never about helping teens cope with trauma. It was a behavioral study, an experiment, and they had all been subjects. Each entry revealed more layers. Subject 006, Jesse M. Subject 009, Benjamin C. One after another, the list expanded. Subject 012, Catherine R. That one hit him like a freight train. Catherine, his first real girlfriend. They'd lost touch after senior year, and she had supposedly moved to Seattle. But now, seeing her name in this context, everything blurred. And then he saw something that made him feel physically sick. A live feed. One of the files opened to a current video stream, clearly surveillance, and there was Catherine. In a small room, sitting on the edge of a bed, staring blankly at a television playing static. A timestamp confirmed it was live, taken just minutes ago. And someone else was in the room with her. Jesse. His voice could be heard softly over the low hum of background interference. He's close. He found the drive. Mark couldn't breathe. Jesse wasn't just alive. He was actively involved. And worse, he knew Mark was watching. The sudden blare of his doorbell nearly made him jump out of his skin. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back slowly. A black SUV idled at the curb. A man in a suit stepped out, not rushing, not aggressive, just calmly walking toward the house like he had been here before. Mark backed away. He wasn't ready. He didn't know who to trust. He shut the laptop, grabbed the drive, and slipped out the back door, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might crack through his ribs. He drove without direction, just needing to get away, to clear his head before the trap closed in fully. But even as the roads blurred by, he knew it was too late for running. The photo, the video, the files, they weren't just evidence. They were a message. This wasn't a secret anymore. It was a play being executed in real time, and he was the central character. The others? They were pawns. Some were playing their parts willingly. Others had no idea they were still being controlled. A call came through. No caller ID. He answered, expecting more threats or cryptic instructions. But it was Ben's voice.
Calm.
Measured. You're probably feeling betrayed right now. I get that. I did too, at first. But this isn't what you think. Jesse's not the villain. Neither am I. We're trying to stop something bigger than either of us ever imagined. What happened to us was just the beginning. Mark nearly screamed into the phone. Then why lie? Why hide this from me? There was a pause. Then Ben replied, because the only way to find out who was still a sleeper was to wake them up. And you, Mark, you were the final one. The line went dead. And Mark finally understood. This wasn't just a conspiracy. It wasn't about 3 kids and a lost summer. It was a psychological operation that had never ended. They were the test subjects, the control group, and now, one by one, they were being reactivated. The stakes weren't about personal truth anymore. They were about systemic manipulation, widespread control, and an organization that had embedded itself so deeply that even the memories of those involved couldn't be trusted. Now, Mark had one chance to decide. Go back into hiding, let the program finish what it started, or blow it all open, and risk everything, including his life. Let me know when you're ready for the final push toward the story's climax. Because what Mark uncovers next isn't just the truth, it's a blueprint for control, and he's about to find out he was never supposed to survive this long. The abandoned medical complex stood like a corpse at the edge of town, fenced in by rusting chain link and blanketed in decades of silence. Mark had driven past it 100 times growing up, never once knowing what it had really been. The community whispered about it, a failed psychiatric facility, a state-funded rehab center, a place where broken minds went to disappear, but nobody had ever told the truth. And now, here he was, standing at the threshold of everything that had haunted him, watching as memories began stitching themselves back together in the deepest corners of his brain. The security footage, the USB files, Ben's cryptic phone call, they had all pointed here. This was where it had started. Operation Mirror Lake wasn't a metaphor. It was a real place, a real experiment. And he was its final, unfinished subject. He slipped through a gap in the fence, flashlight in hand, every muscle in his body coiled with adrenaline. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew, the ceilings sagging with decay, but beneath the rot there was something else, life. Not the kind that brought comfort. The kind that watched. Listened. Predators waiting in the dark. As he moved deeper into the building, he passed peeling murals of smiling families, outdated therapy posters, even children's drawings on faded bulletin boards. It had been designed to feel safe, calming. But all of it was a lie. That was the final genius of the program. It had never been about healing. It had been about simulation, manipulation, control. And now he was stepping back into the belly of the beast, unsure if he was the hunter or the hunted. Down a side corridor, the light flickered to life. He wasn't alone. A voice echoed softly from an intercom speaker near the ceiling, warped by static but unmistakably familiar. You've come far, Mark. Farther than anyone predicted. We thought the reset would hold. But you always were the anomaly. His skin crawled. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't Jesse. It was her. Dr. Vivian Slate, the woman from the therapy videos on the USB drive. She was older now, but the cold in her voice was the same. Clinical.
Precise.
Come to the observation floor, she said. There's someone here who's been waiting to see you. He didn't know why, but his legs moved. He climbed the stairs, past rooms labeled Cognitive Reintegration, Behavioral Modeling, and Memory Redaction Lab. He didn't know which one he'd been in years ago. Maybe all of them. On the top floor, behind a glass wall, stood Jesse.
Real. Alive.
Not the boy he remembered, but a man worn down by secrets, fear, and maybe guilt. I didn't have a choice, Jesse said, his voice cracked from disuse. They told me I'd relapse if I left, that my memories weren't stable, that I was dangerous if I remembered everything. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. Mark stepped closer to the glass. Then why are you still here? Jesse turned to face him fully. Because they're not done. And they knew you'd come. A door opened behind Jesse and in walked Dr. Slate, clipboard in hand, flanked by two men in suits, calm, composed, like walking shadows. You are the final piece, Mark, she said. The only one who never fully integrated. Your resistance, your questions, it made you unique. Difficult, but useful. Mark couldn't hold back anymore. Useful for what? He shouted. What is this? A brainwashing lab? Some kind of military psyop. Dr. Slate didn't flinch.
Worse, she said.
It's a social model. We were testing how malleable memory is under controlled emotional conditioning. You, Jesse, Ben, Catherine, you were part of a group designed to see if artificial trauma could rewire identity.
And it worked.
Too well. Mark shook his head, trying to absorb the weight of it. Why us? He asked, voice cracking. Because your parents volunteered you, she said. In exchange for debt forgiveness. Quiet cleanups of juvenile records. A better future. They thought they were saving you. And in a way, they did. Everything inside him screamed to run, to get Jesse out, to burn the place to the ground. But the two men stepped forward and pulled something from their pockets, syringes. We need to start over, Slate said calmly. You're unstable. We can't have you leaking half-truths. You don't know how much damage that could cause. Mark backed up, grabbing a metal tray from the wall and hurling it at the window. It cracked. Jesse stepped back as the guards advanced. And then something unexpected. Jesse lunged. Not at Mark, but at Slate. He tackled her to the ground, grabbing her clipboard and swinging it at one of the men's faces. Run, he screamed. Mark didn't wait. He smashed the window open with a fire extinguisher, climbed through the glass, and pulled Jesse with him. The hallways exploded in chaos. Alarms blared. Red emergency lights bathed the building in blood tones. Voices shouted through radios. Mark and Jesse ran like hell, twisting through corridors until they found a back stairwell and burst into the night air. Behind them, the building lit up from the inside, not with fire, but with blinding white lights. Drones hovered in the sky. Vans blocked the road. But none of it mattered. Because in Jesse's hand was something that changed everything, a file from Slate's clipboard. Inside was a photo of a much younger Mark, standing in a room with Slate, smiling, signing something. This was never about you being a victim, Jesse whispered, out of breath. You volunteered. The ground beneath Mark collapsed. The world blurred. He had chosen this? He had been part of it? Suddenly, the lost years, the blank memories, they didn't feel stolen. They felt surrendered. He had walked into this willingly, for reasons he didn't yet remember. And now, someone wanted to make sure he never would. Let me know when you're ready for the final part, because the story's not done, and Mark's biggest challenge isn't escaping the program. It's facing who he used to be. Weeks had passed since the night Mark and Jesse escaped from the facility, but the world hadn't stopped spinning, and neither had the questions. Mark had spent those days hiding in quiet corners of cities where no one knew his name, sorting through the shattered fragments of memory, truth, and manipulation that had once been the foundation of his life. The file Jesse had pulled during their chaotic escape became their only real anchor, a printed truth in a sea of uncertainty. Page after page showed images, therapy session logs, and signed consent forms not only from Mark but from every participant, each one initialed in their own hand. And at the very bottom of Mark's file, a brief summary confirmed everything Slate had hinted at, that he had been the first to volunteer, that his mind had proven uniquely responsive to the memory conditioning, and that he had even helped test early simulations on Jesse and Ben before they fully committed to the program. He hadn't just been a victim. He had been a creator, a collaborator. And that truth weighed heavier than any betrayal. Mark's first instinct was denial. He scoured every signature, every timestamp, hoping to find forgery, to catch even the smallest inconsistency that would free him from what the paper claimed. But no matter how much he tried to disprove it, the truth settled like dust in the corners of his consciousness. The person he had been back then, the one who thought helping design a healing simulation might change the world, had believed he was doing good. He had just never seen the darkness waiting on the other side. Jesse was quieter now, more distant. Some days he would talk, others he would just stare off, lost in some memory Mark could never quite reach. They were both broken in ways that words couldn't fix. But at least now, the silence wasn't a lie. They knew what had been done to them. And, maybe more importantly, they knew what they had done to each other. Eventually, Mark reached out to Ben. He had to. He needed to know if Ben's participation had been willful, if his silence had been betrayal or fear. When they met in a neutral spot, a half-abandoned train station just outside Portland, Ben's face carried the weight of someone who had been running for too long. And there, in that cold, echoing space, they laid it all bare. Ben had known. Not everything, not the depth of the program, but enough to understand that the memories they'd been fed weren't real, that the trials weren't ethical, that they had all become part of something monstrous in the name of psychological science. He had tried to pull out years ago, but the program hadn't let go. That's when he realized no one left Mirror Lake. You either stayed compliant or got erased. Not physically, psychologically, slowly, one layer at a time. Mark wanted to expose it all, send the files to the media, post the truth online, force public accountability. But Jesse stopped him. Not out of fear, but clarity. You think blowing the whistle brings justice, Jesse said. But this isn't a headline. It's not a Netflix documentary. It's a machine. And it only survives because people like us forget we're part of it. So, instead of turning to the media, they turned inward. They tracked down others on the subject list quietly, carefully, people like Catherine, who had disappeared after the incident. One by one, they were found, and one by one, they were shown the truth.
Most were shattered by it.
A few didn't want to believe it. But some, just enough, chose to remember. And that became the real mission. Not exposing the operation to the world, but helping those who had been silenced reclaim their memories, their agency, and their lives. It was slower.
Messier.
Harder to measure. But it was real. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. As for Dr. Slate, her trail went cold after the breach. The facility was scrubbed within 48 hours of their escape, erased like it had never existed. The state called it federal property and blocked any FOIA requests. She vanished from public records. No one knew if she had gone underground, been removed by those higher up, or simply slipped into another identity. But every now and then, Jesse would spot someone in a crowd who looked like her. And Mark would catch glimpses of old surveillance vans parked outside motels, just long enough to remind him that watching wasn't something you could turn off. The program might have lost control of its subjects, but that didn't mean it was gone. In the end, Mark stopped trying to fully understand what had happened. Some questions would never have clear answers. Who originally funded the project? How many other programs like Mirror Lake were out there? What had really been erased from his memory that the files didn't show? He didn't know. And maybe he didn't want to. Because living in the past wasn't healing, it was imprisonment. So he started over, in a quiet coastal town where no one recognized his face. He worked under a new name, in a small repair shop, fixing radios and restoring old tech. Something about repairing broken signals helped him feel grounded. Whole. But every now and then, a letter would arrive. No return address. Inside would be a single Polaroid. Sometimes it was of Catherine smiling at a bookstore. Sometimes it was of one of the other subjects, standing in front of a landmark, holding up a hand in acknowledgement. They were alive. They remembered. And that was the closest thing to peace Mark would ever get. The final letter, though, was different. The photo was old, clearly taken years ago, of a group of children no older than 10, sitting in a circle around a woman who looked suspiciously like Slate, her face slightly out of focus, her smile wide. On the back, a note was scrawled in faint pencil. It wasn't the beginning. It was the continuation. Mark stared at it for hours, feeling the chill of something even deeper, more buried, than he had imagined. Because if Mirror Lake had roots that went back that far, then everything he had uncovered was just the surface. The real program hadn't ended. It had only evolved. And somewhere out there, another kid was being asked to sign their name, thinking they were choosing a better life, never knowing they were giving up everything that made them human.